A needle 200 feet high, shaped like a V2 but with a transparent nose, stands pointed defiantly at the hot skies above the Muroc Dry Air Base. In it, Majors Jake McKalley and Abe Grazer will rise to the moon or fall to their death. Welcome to Stories of Futures Past, written when 50 years ago was in the future. Today I present to you The Needle of Space by Ward Botsford, published in 1950. Copyright 1950 to 1978, The Estate of Ward Botsford, used with permission. This story was published in the July 1950 issue of Blue Book, subtitled The Magazine of Adventurous Reading. Blue Book was known as the King of the Pulps, one of the most popular mainstream adventure story magazines. It had been in print since 1905 and lasted until 1975, under various variants of the name and editorial policies. It had some science fiction every so often in amongst all the other more mundane stories. From its pages, we have this pearl of an early speculative story about humanity's first trip to the moon. This would be classified as hard science fiction, being grounded in real science and the understanding of the late 1940s of how this actually could take place. In real life, both the US and the Soviet Union were spending considerable resources on military and rocket development headed up by liberated German scientists, or captured, depending on your point of view. Note the name of the head researcher in the story, and were in a race to get something up there to win the Cold War. The United Nations was still in its infancy. The Soviets had just a couple of years earlier detonated their first nuclear bomb, and were currently in a very aggressive posture after their ruthless intervention in Czechoslovakia and the Berlin blockade. China had just turned fully communist with their civil war ending. The Korean situation looked grim. The nascent Cold War threatened to go hot. All this was stoking the fears of the free world and fueled the need to conquer space. So the space race was on. The idea was that those who could control space and place atom bombs in rockets in orbit or on the moon would control the Earth, and they had to do it before the enemy did. This is the wider context of this story, and the stakes were believed to be very real. The first half of the story is framed as a press conference where the astronauts and their superior field questions from the press corps, including the Soviet TASS. The Cold War rivalry and suspicion was certainly in full swing in 1950. The Q's and A's lets the author explain some of the science and how things would work to the readers of the day who might not have more than a rudimentary understanding of how rockets in space work, or even a false understanding based on the popular 1930s and 40s pew-pew type skiffy. In the second half of the story, we follow along the astronauts on the actual trip to the moon, fraught with danger. For my own part, I find it very interesting to note the similarities to and differences from the actual moonshot that took place almost 2 decades later, and which is now almost 60 years ago. One example is the time it took to escape the Earth's gravity and achieve low orbit above the atmosphere in real life was approximately 11 minutes. In the story, this takes 47. It really goes to show that this is speculative fiction, based on what they knew and the educated guesses they made at the time. Do you spot any other similarities or differences? Please state them in the comments below. Enjoy! The Needle of Space by Ward Botsford. Copyright 1950 to 1978. The Estate of Ward Botsford. Used with permission. Originally published in Blue Book magazine, July 1950. Narrated by Tom Trussell. A needle 200 feet high, shaped like a V2, but with a transparent nose, stands pointed defiantly at the hot skies above the Muroc Dry Air Base. In it, Majors Jake McKalley and Abe Grazer will rise to the moon, or fall to their death. There was a somewhat strained chuckle from Jake and the Colonel as Abe finished reading the lead article in the New York News. "We're heroes, Colonel. Damned if we ain't." Jake lifted his 5'6" out of the wicker chair. "Horse feathers. You haven't even started yet, and already you're heroes. You fellows know as well as I do that the real heroes in this business were the two who went on the first man-carrying rocket." The Colonel was slightly sarcastic. Abe Grazer laughed shortly. If the jerk who wrote that stuff were going to take this jaunt— Abe was never known to refer to the monumental project as anything but a jaunt— "he'd maybe not be so enthusiastic." "You could be right. And now you'd better both get dressed in your prettiest new clothes, because at 1600 you've got a meeting with the biggest bunch of these newspaper boys you ever hoped never to see." The Colonel paused, and then grinned slyly at Abe. "Including the gentleman who wrote those fine lines about my heroes." Then he grew serious again. "You got 15 minutes. Meet me at the Public Information Center as quickly as possible." At 15:55, the buzzer sounded, and Abe came out to answer, buttoning his shirt as he came. "Sergeant Walken calling for you and Major McKalley, sir." "Right, Sarge. With you in a minute. Shake it up, Jake. It's our bodyguard." The two officers rapidly finished dressing, policed each other with a glance, and came out. "All set, Sergeant." The three men stepped out into the broiling sun. Before them was an official limousine surrounded by Secret Service agents, armed with Tommy guns. The Air Force was taking no chance with their moon men. "How's chances to stop at the PX for some cigarettes, Sarge?" Jake asked. "Sorry, sir. My orders are to make top speed to the PIC, with no stops at all." "Well, damn." The majors were not amused at this safeguard of their persons. The car roared away. Secret Service men riding on the running board. The PIC was only about a half-mile distant, but the Air Force wanted to make sure of everything. As they pulled up, the Colonel was there to meet them, and without speaking, he took them into his office at one side of the big main hall and motioned them to a couple of easy chairs. In the hall itself, Abe and Jake could see the reporters. Close to 200 of them. The Colonel started pacing to and fro, as was his habit when he was about to deliver a lecture. "Now, I'm not going into the tech end of this thing." He was well into his stride now. 4 paces and turn, 4 paces and turn again. "That's out of my line. But what I want to say is this. Damned near as important as the trip itself is the press conference you'll be into in a few minutes. You know as well as I that there are representatives of papers out there who hate the Air Force, who think the $7 billion spent on rocket research was a waste of money. These men and others like them are the kind who have blocked more funds, so that this trip is being made a lot tougher than it need be for all of us." He turned and pointed a finger at them, as though they were responsible. "With just a few millions more, we could have given you an atomic drive instead of the old liquid fuel one. But oh no! Results, they yell. We want results. Then you'll get your money, maybe. So it's up to you two to get us this money. If you're able to impress enough of these people with the importance of this project, and then if you reach the moon, we'll get the funds. Fail on either point, either one, Major, and it's goodbye Rocket Corps, goodbye Air Corps." The pacing suddenly ceased, and the voice continued, cold and hard. "Answer any and all questions fully, politely, and to the point. I want no sarcasm. Get that, Grazer?" They both understood perfectly what was expected of them. A temporary dais had been raised at one end of the main hall, and behind it was a blackboard bearing several diagrams. As the colonel and the majors came out on the dais, the noisy babble of the reporters became somewhat less. Without preamble, the colonel began to speak with a firm assurance and clarity. "At 1816, the first manned rocket to the moon is scheduled to take off. These men are the pilots. They will answer your questions, so I won't bore you with generalities. Don't forget, we still have security rules, and if your questions fall outside of them, they won't be answered. None of you may file with your offices until 1900. Okay, Majors, the show is yours." After a brief pause, a woman's voice broke into the silence. "Can you give us some technical data?" At a nod from his partner, Jake asked, "Just what sort of data?" "Well, what are you using for fuel?" At the colonel's assent, Jake began. "You see, the exact mixture is a secret, but we are using a mixture of liquid oxygen and one of the hydrocarbons. Can't tell you which one." "And that will furnish all the fuel you need?" "Yes, ma'am. You see, we're using a step rocket." Jake turned to the blackboard and pointed to a rough outline of the moon rocket. "About 9/10 of the weight of the rocket is fuel. We will use approximately half of the fuel in getting free of Earth gravity, which will be during the first 47 minutes of flight. After that, the fuel valves will shut off, and our impetus will drive us the rest of the way into the moon's gravitational pull, when we go into freefall until about 3,000 miles from the moon, when braking rockets will be turned on. This will use 1/10 of our fuel supply, because landing a rocket, tubes down, even in limited gravity, is tough. Then, to get free of moon gravity on the takeoff, we'll need about 3/8 of our supply. This leaves us with only about 3/20 of our fuel for correcting course, etc. Naturally, this reserve is very small," Jake concluded flatly. Abe took up the ball. "The rocket is divided into 5 main segments, something like a caterpillar. As we exhaust the fuel in the section nearest the rear, that part drops off. This will happen exactly 4 times during flight, so when we land on Earth again, the rocket will only be about 50 feet long. We thus effect a considerable saving in fuel due to decreased weight." Here the colonel cut in as Abe paused. "You all realize that the 3/20th margin of fuel supply is terribly small. To alleviate this situation, the Air Corps has carried out an experiment. During the past 8 months, we have fired 5 robot rockets to the moon. These were smaller than the moon rocket and carried in their noses a large charge of flash powder, which was detonated on contact, thus announcing to observers their arrival on the moon. Also, they carried a package of red powder, which made the contact point easy to locate with our big telescopes. That much you know. But what you don't know is that these rockets each had a compartment containing a small reserve fuel supply. The colonel paused to let the full import of this take effect. Here was news indeed, and the news hawks looked more interested as the colonel again took up his talk. 4 of the 5 rockets hit the moon in the immediate neighborhood of Tycho. The other was lost somewhere in space. It is hoped that the moon rocket will be able to obtain some of this planted fuel supply for their return flight. Questions came thick and fast now. How much fuel does the moon rocket carry? This from the TASS man. Sorry, can't answer that. A quick reply. How will they transfer the fuel to the moon rocket? It's light, easy to carry. How will they locate it, if it's there? This from a syndicate man known for his skeptical attitude. Ignoring the implication of doubt, the colonel answered politely. All the fuel supply rockets carried some radioactive materials which will make possible the use of a Geiger counter. As the flood of questions subsided, the colonel looked around hopefully. More questions, if you please. We have a little more time to give you. A small grey-haired man from a Midwestern country journal asked a trifle timidly, How do these rockets move after they get out where there is no air to push against? The man was genuinely puzzled, and the colonel looked at Abe, who was more or less known for his patience with academic questions, for this was the question asked by all novices in rocket science. The answer came with no trace of condescending knowledge. You see, sir, a rocket moves by reaction. A certain law of physics states that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Thus, when we explode a molecule of fuel, it expands to 1,000 times its original size. Obviously, this increased size demands more room. It expands out of the rocket tubes and drives us ahead. The explosion is the action. Our moving ahead is the reaction. Something like shooting off a gun. Actually, the absence of air in outer space allows us to move much faster because we're not slowed down by the friction of the air. Does that make it clear, sir? Thanks, Major. I understand it now. The little man still looked puzzled, but he was evidently willing to mull over the information for himself. A Chicago Tribune man now came up with, How fast will you be going, Colonel? With an air of satisfaction at this question, the colonel said quietly, At peak, about 30,000 miles per hour, which will be reached 45 minutes after takeoff, and sustained without diminishing for 2 hours. An astonished murmur greeted this statement. 30,000 miles per hour. The speed was unthinkable. And from the same questioner, I thought such speed would kill you. Jake answered him this time. You're confusing speed with acceleration. Man can, theoretically, travel at any speed up to 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light, when the law of limitation, as established by Einstein, stops him. Right now, you're moving with the Earth around its axis at one speed. The Earth, in turn, is moving around the Sun, which is moving toward the outer reaches of the galaxy, which is moving toward another galaxy. And in addition to this, the entire known universe may be moving in an unknown direction at an unknown speed. So you can see you're already moving considerably in excess of 30,000 miles per hour. This was too much for the reporter. He simply shook his head while Jake went on relentlessly, obviously warmly interested in his subject. On the other hand, man's body can stand just so many Gs. The number of G's indicates the amount of gravity or weight being exerted. 1 G is normal Earth gravity, 2 G twice gravity, or twice your weight, and so on. When we hit the moon, we'll weigh less, thanks to less gravity, and if man ever reaches Jupiter, we'll weigh 100 times our weight, or 100 Gs. The science writers pricked up their ears. This was something in their line, where they could make the newsmen, who looked down on them, stand back and listen. The number of Gs a man can stand safely is 10, is it not, Major? This from the science editor of the New York Times. Yes, 10 is correct, and at no time will more than 10 Gs be exerted. In other words, speed will be built up very gradually as we leave Earth, and when we come back it will be decreased gradually. How'll they steer it? A man from the Cleveland plain dealer asked. It was the colonel's turn. They won't. In firing the 100 and more other deep-space manned rockets, as well as our 2 satellite rockets, we've learned that nerve reaction in space is too slow. All steering except for minor course corrections will be operated by radar from Earth. This will switch off when the brake rockets switch on. Landing will be manual, since terrain data is not available in sufficient detail. On return flight, the men will fire the rockets themselves, and automatic control will take over at 80 miles up. Another gentleman from the New York Times. How will you land on the Earth again, Major? Same way you took off? Jake McKalley took this one. No, we won't have enough fuel for that, and anyway, it would be too tricky with Earth's increased gravity. We're going to land in the Pacific. The rocket will float, and we can manage to land it fairly accurately. The next question came quickly from a far corner. Where in the Pacific? But the colonel was just as quick. Security, he cut in sharply. What happens if you encounter a meteor or a comet or something? A Los Angeles reporter wanted to know. Very small chance of that, said the colonel. Despite what you may have heard, space is essentially empty. The chances of meeting any vagrant stuff of a size to do them any harm is about 1,000,000 to 1. Again a pause, which was broken by the skeptical news syndicate representative whose voice had been raised most violently against the entire moon rocket project. Just what's the point? You've spent over $7 billion, and what have you got to show for it? Even if you reach the moon, and I don't think you can, what have you got? A damned hunk of rock. To this there was only a murmur of approval, and the colonel was pleased to note a swell of protesting voices as he answered quickly. To begin with, we believe we will land, and it is a considerable scientific achievement to be the first nation to do so. Also, we do have some practical purposes in view. First, an astronomical observatory set up on the moon would be much more efficient than any of the Earth, because of the absence of clouds, smoke, and dirt, which obscure the view. Next, a weather station on the moon will be able to give us much detailed information of value, and add to these things the factor of the unknown. Much may be made of the moon. Who can tell until we've been there? Then the representative of TASS spoke in his heavy accent, and with what he called a smile belying the malice of his words. And is it not also true, Colonel, that the United States of America plans to claim all moon territory for herself so that she may mount rocket sites to attempt to annihilate the USSR? Complete silence, as everyone waited for the reply, which came clearly and coldly from the colonel. Yes, we intend to claim moon territory, and any other nation reaching the moon can do the same, including Russia. As for rocket bases, that is security. The smile of the taskman became more revolting as he asked softly, "And is it not true that the UN forbade you to go to the moon?" The colonel's control was almost audible now. "The UN was told of the USA's intention, and when vote was taken, the Russian bloc of countries opposed the rest of the world. So we are going with the approval of over 3/4 of the vote." Jake glanced at his watch and spoke briefly to the colonel. "That's all, gentlemen. Be at the observation post at 1800. Again, I'll remind you, no filing until 1900. The three men walked briskly back to the colonel's office, where they dropped back into the easy chairs. Jake lit a cigarette. "How can the rocket move?" he mimicked the man of the question with complete lack of humor. The colonel gave him an exaggeratedly angry look, held it for a moment, then smiled with satisfaction. "It was a good show. My end's finished now. The science boys will want you two at Lab 3 now. I'll see you before blast-off." Their bodyguard was waiting with a limousine, the sergeant asleep in the back seat. "Up and at 'em, Sarge. Lab 3, pronto." After traversing about a mile at top speed, they pulled up before a low, poorly proportioned building surrounded with a highly charged electric fence. After the formalities of recognition, the majors went in. In the small reception office they were met by Dr. Lewis Halley, the medico, who was accompanied by the bear-like Professor Karl Otto von Clausewitz, the German physicist who was largely responsible for the moon rocket. Without preamble, he said, "You are late. We must move. Fast on them, doctor. We have little more than an hour." This in clipped, sharp English. The doctor, followed by von Clausewitz and several assistants, led them into an examining room. "Disrobe, leave your clothes on this rack, and they will be returned to your rooms. Now, over here, please. How long since you gentlemen have drunk any spirits?" 24 hours, sir. Those were our orders." "Good. We'll just make sure. Blow your breath in here," as an assistant handed them each a bottle. The brief check, and the doctor grunted inarticulately. Then followed the most complete physical examination to which Abe and Jake had ever been subjected. Finally, it was over. With a guarded smile, the doctor looked up at them. "You're both in fair condition. Major McKalley, watch that knee where you once broke it. Major Grazer, there will be no sugar for you en route. Put on these robes, please." He went out quickly. It was the professor's turn now. "I'll not dwell on orders I trust you have already memorized. I'll merely remind you of essentials. Under nothing but the most unavoidable necessity are you to touch the rocket controls. I do not wish to have my rocket damaged by a couple of meddlers." He looked at them as if he fully expected they would crash the rocket on takeoff. "Conserve all fuel you can. The hope of your being able to transfer that fuel on the moon to your ship is slim. Very slim. You now have exactly 26 minutes in which to dress. Come this way, please." They moved to another section of the building, where the flight kits were kept. Lieutenant Colonel Harris met them cordially. "Greetings, chums, or should I say chumps? Okay, boys, bring out the swimming suits." The technicians wheeled out 2 spacesuits and with broad grins took the major's robes. The first garments they put on were light coveralls which clothed them from feet to neck, then heavy rubber G-suits, which were intended partially to eliminate the acceleration effect. Over this was put the still heavier spacesuit made of thorium and encased with heating and refrigeration tubes. The helmets, resembling divers' helmets, were put in their hands. "Now on the scales, boys. Got to see if you weigh too much. Whoops, help him there, Corporal. Jake, 315. Abe, 331. Okay, that'll do it. Away with you. Bring me back a piece of moon cheese." Abe and Jake were now helped onto a small electric runabout which had two well-padded seats. For these seats they were grateful. Carrying your own weight in a spacesuit is not easy. A Secret Serviceman ran the car down an inclined plane to the third basement and along a narrow, well-lighted corridor where MPs, heavily armed, were stationed every few feet. Finally, after several minutes, they were in the high vaulted room which held the moon rocket. A huge scaffolding spanned the 200-foot rocket, and on this many men scampered like ants around their queen. To the rocket itself were attached nearly 50 lengths of hose, caught to the sleek beryllium sides like leeches. But there the similarity ended, for unlike leeches, these tubes pumped life into the rocket. Fuel in its various components, life-giving oxygen, water, ammonia gas for refrigeration, etc. The runabout pulled up at the base of the scaffold, and the officers were carried into the tiny elevator. Up it went to the nose of the rocket, where they were met by the headquarters staff, including the colonel, who asked quickly, "Everything okay?" "Good." The two technicians now moved the pilots into the cockpit of the rocket, access to which was through a single airlock. Double ones would have been better, of course, but space was at a premium. This was dramatically illustrated by the closeness of the living quarters. In the eye of the ship, which was composed of a single piece of plexiglass, were the recoil chairs. These were high-backed so that they extended a full foot above the tops of the men's heads. They were braced with hydraulic pistons to help break the effect of suddenly increased gravity, and in deep space they could be let down to form beds. The technicians hurried to strap Abe and Jake in their seats with foot-wide elastic bands which encircled them from feet to neck. The helmets, which would not be needed unless the ship were punctured, were laid to one side. Hoses were then attached to their suits which, in case of accident, would feed them air and heat. The instrument board was a marvel of simplicity. An air pressure dial, a speed indicator, fuel pressure gauge were all that were immediately visible. Between the two seats, where in an airplane a joystick or wheel would have been, was something which looked vaguely like the indicator board on an Empire State Building elevator. It was round and contained a symmetrical pattern of red lights with corresponding switches. This was the console. Press one of those switches, and you fired a corresponding rocket tube. Fire the right-hand tubes, the ship turned left, and so on. These were of no immediate interest to Abe and Jake, as they would be fired automatically at takeoff. Behind the chairs stretched a narrow passage running for about 25 feet, on either side of which were stores of one kind or another. Portable tanks of oxygen, thermite charges, fuel for the refrigerant units, and the like. "All strapped in and ready, Colonel?" "Right. We'll keep in touch by radio radar as long as possible. Your tape recorder will pick up everything you say. Be sure you reload it every 24 hours. 30 seconds from takeoff. Release your chairs. Make no attempt to move during the time full thrust is being applied. Also, hell, you know the rest. Just take care of yourselves." There was genuine affection in the colonel's voice. "Why, Colonel, you'd think that you really loved Jake and me." The colonel sputtered and left the airlock. "Close it up, Major." Abe pressed a stud, and the huge mass of the airlock dropped into place from its concealment in the upper casing. The ship was now sealed airtight. Jake flipped a switch which fed them the necessary amount of oxygen. Another switch, and the automatic thermostat was brought into play. They looked out of the greenhouse. 200 feet below, cranes were removing the scaffolding. Then it was gone, and they were alone. The radio sputtered. Testing, testing, over, over. Roger, Roger, I'm receiving you loud and not so clear. There was a curse from the other end. A minute passed. Testing, testing, how do you read me? Over, over. I'm receiving you loud and clear, over. Time is now 18:10. 6 minutes to blast off. Platform being raised, over and out. They looked down and saw that the massive platform was slowly moving toward the ceiling. As they looked up, they saw the ceiling fracture and split asunder to admit the needle of space. Above were stars, the constellation of Gemini. There was Vega, and there at its fullest was the moon. Now the platform had stopped. Ground level. To port were the observation posts, one for the military, one for the press. On the ground, tiny figures were attaching hoses to the base of the rocket, priming fuel. Time now 18:14, 2 minutes to go. Jake and Abe looked quietly at each other. Time now 18:15, 60 seconds to blast off. Last test. You should be able to push a signal to us at the end of full thrust. We may not be able to contact you. Acknowledge. Over. Roger, Wilco. Over. 40 seconds to blast off. 35, 30. Release chairs. They pulled the catches, and the chairs then rested in a semi-reclining position on their pistons. 20, 15, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, stand by. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, fire. At first, there was only a dull roar in their ears, with no sensation of lift. They could see the middle bank of rockets cut in on the console, then another bank, and then another. They could feel the ship rising now, slowly and with a feeling of majestic power, then with increased speed, and a giant hand pressed them to the recoil chairs. Their vision grew dim. More speed. More speed. After the momentary blackout, the men managed to look around. Although a huge weight seemed to be pressing on their bodies, they were all right. The altimeter showed them to be 347 miles up and rising rapidly. The first step of the rocket had detached itself. Speed was 19,000 miles per hour, and it, too, was increasing at a rapid rate. Outside was black as pitch. No view of Earth was to be had. Then, as they watched, the last bank of rockets cut in. Again, a more terrible weight. Speed indicator 25,000, 26,000. Darkness blurred their eyes. Later they awoke. The oppressive weight was gone. Abe spoke first. Speed indicator shows 30,000 miles per hour. Yeah, what's the time? Shows 1916. 1 hour from blastoff. You okay? Sure, you? Yeah, let's look around. Outside, the stars were twinkling. But no, they weren't twinkling. They were steady points of light. No atmosphere to distort the view. Nothing but stars, 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 Jake marveled. The moon was invisible below the horizon since, naturally, they were not aimed directly at it. It was a magnificent sight. Just stars. More than any astronomer had ever seen. The curious thing was that there was no sense of movement. The rocket was, for the time, dead. Of course, there was nothing by which to gauge their movement, just space. After staring at the immensities for some minutes, Abe spoke in a somewhat subdued voice. "Better get up now." "What the hell was that?" as a muffled crash sounded from aft. Jake smiled. "Getting nervous? That was the second step, remember?" "Sure, now I do." Abe was quick to recover his composure. "You loose?" They had completely unwound themselves except for their safety belts. "Yeah, but I'm going back to get some food before we radio in. Want anything?" "Bring me some water, will you?" Jake unfastened the belt and started to heave himself out of the chair. Immediately he rose to the ceiling. "Hey, look! I'm flying!" "Fine, fine, you're flying. Go get that water for me." Jake swam. No other word described it. Back to the water tank, which was pressure-fed. Otherwise, there would have been no water, since there was no gravity to push it down, as is normally the case. He filled 2 containers which looked like steins, but differed in that they were completely closed except for a hole in which Jake now inserted plastic straws. Then he got down a package of rations, marked with his name, and another marked for Abe. Each man had a separate type, and a small telescope. Suddenly, in a quandary as how to carry all this, he saw a long piece of string where it had been left on the floor. He chuckled and picked it up, attached all the stuff to one end of it and the other end to his belt. Then he started forward. Abe was loose now, and with a pleased look was contentedly lying on nothing, about 2 feet from the ceiling. As he heard Jake coming, he languidly turned his head. "Look, levitation. Pretty good, huh? Where's my water?" Jake handed him the end of the string. "Just pull on this." Abe did so, and was amused to see the stuff floating at the end of it. After eating a bit from his K-rations, about which he made the usual impolite and bitter comments, and sucking some water through the straw, he asked, "How far we come, anyhow? Better call base before we get out of range." Jake looked at the speed indicator, which still registered a steady 30,000 miles per hour, and answered, "Probably about 45 to 50,000 miles. Hard to tell. We've only been making top for about 20 minutes. Want to call base while I take a look through the telescope?" Abe switched on the radar radio and started to send. "Moon rocket to base. Moon rocket to base. Can you hear me? Over." "I'm receiving you dimly, Moon rocket. Are you getting me? Over." "I'm receiving you dim and clear. All is well here. No harmful effects noted. A bit sore is all. Over. Colonel here to talk to you." A short pause, and the colonel's voice came over faintly. "We are still picking you up on radar, but you are getting dim. You're on course now, but you'd better cut in your own radar course finder. Over." "Right. What's our ETA? On Moon, that is." "One moment. You land at 0832, day after tomorrow. Can now give you instructions for radar pickup when you leave. Tune to 89.99. Got that? 89.99. Do not stay on Moon longer than necessary for primary research and get the fuel. Got that? Over." "Got it. We'll pick you up on 89.99 about 0900 on Sunday. Your signal too weak for further talking. Over." "Roger, Wilco, over and out." Jake looked at his partner in mock disappointment. "No fond message from home? No patriotic sentiments?" "Shut up and get that course finder working." Jake turned to the small screen of the radar finder. When it had warmed up, he read off the resulting figures to Abe, who, after some calculations, said, "Not too bad. About 1/10 of a degree off. We'll fire correcting rockets before we land at about 3,000 miles from Moon, okay? Okay, now what? Relax and get some sleep. I'll keep watch for stray meteorites. Good night, sweet one. Neither threats nor insults could keep Jake from sleep. He released the piston of his recoil chair and settled back, after making fast the safety belt so he would stay put in the chair. Immediately he was asleep. An hour later he wakened. Abe was peering into space. Everything all right? Yep, look starboard. Jake saw a huge star, its corona mounting out in huffing bursts of energy. For a moment he was frightened, until he realized that it was Old Sol. It did look odd. Only a big star. No reflected light, of course. Just the blank, ugly-looking flames. Now look to port. About 10 o'clock. Pretty, isn't it? It was the moon, but one greatly increased in size. Their target, Tycho, was plainly visible, its 56-mile-wide crater staring up at them. What's the time? 2000. I'll hit the sack now, and you keep watch. When Jake woke up 2 hours later, they had a lot of fun floating water in huge gobs in midair. Abe even managed to learn the swan dive. Reaction finally set in, however. They began to feel sick in the stomach. Space sickness. It wasn't too bad, however. The worst of it was that time hung heavy on their hands. Wake up, Jacob. Time to get to work. What's up? Jake was instantly wide awake. Getting close. Time to think about braking rockets. Right. I'll play the console. You feed me the figures. All was business now. What's the speed? 17,000 miles per hour, slowing gradually. Distance from Moon? I make it 5,230. Tycho visible? Here, look through the telescope. Jake looked. There in sharp, startling relief was the huge expanse of Tycho with all its numerous surrounding craters. The slope of the crater rose an abrupt 12,000 feet like a circle of daggers. Spot anything? No, not a thing. Wait, I think I can see the circle of stain spread from one of the fuel rockets. Yeah, that's what it is. All right, get ready to play that console. I'll make us a total of 1/8 degree off course. Fire rocket 16, 17, 18, and 19 for 3 seconds. Strap yourself in first. Both men put the recoil chairs on their pistons and secured their tapes. Abe pushed the 4 studs, and the increased G's hit them momentarily. When the rockets shut off, they were headed almost directly toward Tycho. What's the speed now? 18,500 miles per hour and steady. Moon gravity and the course rockets, I guess. Might as well keep strapped in. We're only 3,000 miles out. Time for braking rockets. Better start the gyro. Jake shoved home the starter of the big motor which would bring the gyro into play and allow them to come down stern first. First bank of brake rockets on. The speed indicator began to drop gradually. Not fast enough. Fire the second and third banks. Fired. They were suffering mightily under the rapid deceleration. Cut braking rockets. Engage gyro. Distance from surface 300 miles. When in hell is that gyro going to catch? Slowly the big ship turned around, its tail now pointed down. Switch on surface radar. Speed now 850. Shall I cut in back rockets? Got to wait until I pick up a good landing place. He scanned the image on the radar screen. Fire outer rim in intermittent blasts. Abe played on the console like a master on his organ. Speed 500. Jake chanted. Distance 10 miles. Change course 19 degrees. Fire 15 and 17 full for 2 seconds. Now full on all rockets for 1/2 second. The rocket seemed to be held motionless before it again started downward. Speed now 150. Keep on intermittent blasts. Fire 3 for 2 seconds. Now 1 more. Speed 100. Distance 3 miles. How we doing? All right. Steady 1/4 second blast on all rim rockets. I'll read distances now. You keep your eye on that screen. 2 miles. Speed 75. Dropping okay. Fire tube 1 for 3/4 second. Now 4 for a full second. Speed 30 miles per hour and dropping. Distance 3/4 mile. Steady at 20 miles per hour. About 50 feet now. 25 feet. Fire all tubes 1/10 second. There was a huge jolt as the rocket met moon. Silence. Then a cough from Abe. I guess we're here. Now that will look fine in a history book. The first thing our moon man said when he landed was, I guess we're here. All right then, how about this? Oh, great and magnificent orb, I claim... Can it? Let's see what's outside. Got to check fuel first. Get that stuff ready, will you? Jake got out the Geiger counters, oxygen tanks and refrigerant which would be needed. He also procured a pair of alpenstocks. How's the fuel look? Not too good. We used more than 1/10 in landing. Hope we're able to salvage some of the fuel rocket stuff, or else. We'll worry about that later. Here's your helmet and gloves. Put them on while I check outside temperature. Abe pulled on the cumbersome-looking gloves and connected their coils with those on his main suit. The helmet was then screwed into place by giving it a half-turn and dogging it down firmly. Jake came up to him and began to talk, but Abe could hear nothing. Finally, he had the presence of mind to open his faceplate. What did you say? I said the temperature outside is a nice cool 197 degrees, damn near boiling. I sincerely trust that our refrigeration plant works. You feel all right now, don't you? The plant is working okay for the ship. It'll be okay for the suits. Let's go. Jake put on the gloves and helmet, then tested the radio which would allow them to communicate. Okay, testing. I'm getting you. Am I all right? Sure thing. Close your faceplate and start your air and cooling plant. After this was done, Jake moved to a wheel at the side of the ship and spun it rapidly. Immediately there was a hissing sound as the air in the ship was rapidly exhausted. When the pressure gauge told him that pressure was at 0, he moved to the airlock. Abe pushed a button and up it slid. A momentary wave of heat hit them before the cooling unit brought the temperature down to a not-too-cool 90 degrees. They stepped out the door and climbed down the rope ladder which Jake had got from the stores. The door closed behind them, protecting the interior of the ship. On the surface, they stepped into what appeared to be foot-deep pumice-like dust. This rose in lazy clouds and settled very slowly behind them. Silence. Not a sound, not a movement. The walls of Tycho towered over them about a half-mile distant. The rocket had come to rest in a narrow plain about half a mile long and a 1/4 mile wide. There were no gradual shadows, just light and black, no greys. Abe broke the silence. Let's see if we damage the tubes in landing. They walked around to the end where projecting tubes could be seen. Hey, that's funny. I didn't hear that third step come loose, did you? No, but we were probably landing when it did. Tubes seem to be all right. The ground for 50 feet around the rocket was scorched black in violent contrast to the surrounding white pumice. You bring the cameras? Abe asked. Yeah, you take the still. I'll handle the movies. Let's start hunting for those fuel rockets. Can't see them anywhere. Use the Geigs. They pointed the foot-long wand of the Geiger counters this way and that like a dowser using his dowsing rod. Strongest signals coming from this way, Abe said. Come on. They walked with ease, thanks to the lessened gravity, stopping now and then to take pictures. Finally, they came upon a small crater barely 100 feet across. Maximum signal here. Guess the rocket fell down in this. We'll never get it. That's a cinch. Let's find another. Finally, they located the one Jake had seen from the air. It was lying, partly smashed, in its 100-foot patch of red powder. Fuel's in the rear end. Let's look. They had to open the fuel door with a crowbar, but there were the two big containers of liquid oxygen and the hydrocarbon. Tie a rope on them, and we'll carry 'em between us, Jake suggested. After half an hour's work, they were back at the ship. Working swiftly, they opened the fuel compartment and connected the large tanks in series with the others. I'll start taking samples of rock, and you can go look for some more rockets. Be sure to talk to me frequently so you don't get lost. Jake began breaking off chunks of rock, labeling and storing them in sample boxes. To his considerable annoyance, instead of talking, Abe began to sing, but Jake was able to ignore it. An hour later, Abe came trudging back, breaking his pace with playful 15-foot leaps and carrying an oxygen bottle. Is that all you got? Jake demanded. Yup. One rocket was down in a crevice, another in a crater, and I got this from the last one. It was smashed up something awful. The hydro was busted. Oh, fine. Well, that's that. Let's get back aboard and hustle something to eat. We've got more pictures to take, and then we can get the hell out of this place. As they headed back to the ship, a huge geyser of dust and rock rose about halfway down the plain. There was no sound, only the dust. What was that, for God's sake? Jake shrugged it off. Meteor, I guess. Let's go. They went up the ladder, opened the airlock, and when they were inside, fresh air was pumped in, and soon they were able to take off their helmets. After lunch, they again went outside and finished what the Army engineers called primary survey work. Getting close to leaving time? You got all your stuff stored? Yes, sir. Just trust Abraham to take care of himself. After checking fuel, Jake said with obvious relief, With any kind of luck at all, we'll make it. Let's strap up. Finally, it was blast-off time, and this time they were doing the firing. All right, said Jake. Blast off when you're ready. Check, here goes. He depressed all firing studs, and with a sudden swoosh the rocket rose majestically as before. This time the gravity was not so bad for them. At 5,000 miles out, the speed was a mere 11,000 miles per hour, sufficient to get them to Earth, but not enough to waste fuel in unnecessary speed. On the second day out, Jake said, Try the radio, Abe. It should be working by now. We're only 50,000 miles from Earth. After a moment's warm-up, the radio began to splutter. Moon rocket to base, moon rocket to base, over, over. To their joy, the well-defined voice of the colonel came over, albeit somewhat dimly. It said, My heroes, welcome home. The End. About the author. Ward Botsford, born June 22nd, 1927, died April the 1st, 2004, was a New York-based triple Emmy Award-winning record producer, author, and classical music specialist renowned for his contributions to the classical music recording industry. In the 1980s, he was the founder of Arabesque Records, which started out specializing in reviving historic performances of classical music and later expanded into jazz and original recordings of obscure composers. He also authored a science service book called Archaeology, Middle America, which saw more than 20 additional printings, and a children's book version of the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, The Pirates of Penzance. You know the one. I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England, and I quote the fights historical from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical. Science fiction. Botsford's science fiction contributions were two published short stories, The Needle of Space, published in Blue Book magazine July 1950, and This World is Condemned, published in Rocket Stories April 1953. With his daughter Diana Drew Botsford, he co-wrote the Season 6, Episode 7 episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called Rascals, the one where Picard and some crew turn into 12-year-olds by a transporter accident, and some Ferengi pirates take over the Enterprise. Shenanigans ensue. Working for Caedmon Records in the 1970s, he produced many spoken word recordings, what today would be called audiobooks, at the time released on vinyl LP record and audio tape cassette, and usually excerpts or abridged due to the maximum running time of approximately 70 minutes for an LP. He produced a fair few science fiction classics, including Robert A. Heinlein's short stories The Green Hills of Earth and Gentlemen, Be Seated, H. G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, Ray Bradbury's short stories There Will Come Soft Rains and Usher 2 from the Martian Chronicles, and The Veldt and Marionettes Incorporated from The Illustrated Man, all narrated by Leonard Nimoy, that's Spock, but also Isaac Asimov's Foundation, the Psychohistorians, comprising the first 8 chapters of Foundation, and Henry Kuttner's Mimsy Were the Borogroves, both narrated by William Shatner, that's Captain Kirk. C. L. Moore's Chambleur, narrated by the author, Theodore Sturgeon's Baby is 3 from his More Than Human, read by the author, and 4 different albums with fixed-up excerpts from Frank Herbert's June trilogy, selected and read by the author. Botsford also worked on several sets of recordings of short stories and excerpts from Arthur C. Clarke's longer works, such as Transit of Earth, The 9 Billion Names of God, The Star, Childhood's End, The Fountains of Paradise, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and 2010, Odyssey 2, all narrated by the author himself. He maintained friendships with these authors, and, indeed, works by Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert A. Heinlein, and Frank Herbert all have dedications to Botsford by the authors. Oh yes, he also produced recordings of beloved children's books such as Where the Wild Things Are and Winnie the Pooh, amongst many others. Space. Botsford had a strong interest in space travel and astronomy, as should be evident in this story. In the 1960s, He collaborated with NASA to record the sounds of the Mercury and Gemini flights for historical archives. This included the 1962 Friendship 7 mission flown by John Glenn, where he became the first American to orbit the Earth. In addition to making field recordings of the sounds of the NASA rockets, he also recorded the sounds of supersonic jets. He was treated to a flight beyond the sound barrier in a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, and thereby given the Royal Order of Star Riders, becoming a member of the exclusive club for those who got to be a passenger in one of these record-breaking fighter jets, or manned missiles, depending on your point of view. They look like a massive rocket with itty-bitty wings on the sides, and would not have looked too out of place in a certain film franchise set in a galaxy far, far away. Indeed, he got to fly with a variety of NASA's celebrated astronauts, including Neil Armstrong and Gordon Cooper. Botsford was also a founding member of several organizations that supports space science. The Needle of Space by Ward Botsford is copyright 1950 to 1978, the estate of Ward Botsford, used with permission. This story has been saved from oblivion and painstakingly transcribed by yours truly. Do you want to help support my work? Go to storiesoffuturespast.substack.com/about.